I have returned. I didn't fade away like an old soldier. I'm waiting back on shore to do battle once again. So I'm Steve Balch. Ready to go? Okay. Did you get those remarks, my opening remarks there, about that wonderful joke I made? No? Okay. So I'm Steve Balch. I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. And as I noted, we're alive and well, and we will have an interesting program throughout the year, of which this is the very first event. And it's an event that is meant to commemorate. It's not quite on Constitution Day, which was yesterday, the 17th, but close enough. You never can stop commemorating the Constitution, as far as I'm concerned. And I know we have an advocate for the Articles of Confederation here, but perhaps we'll persuade him before the day is over. We have here to deliver, it's an oration, it would have to be, no doubt, our Constitution Day oration. We have an old friend of mine, Dr. Susan Hanssen, who is professor of history at the University of Dallas. She is a remarkable teacher and a remarkable scholar. Her work deals with both American and British history, and so the great tradition upon which our Constitution was established. She also has a special interest in Henry Adams, who, as you probably know, was a descendant of John, one of the notable Adamses that has graced our history, a great writer of letters, and a man about civilization, I would describe him as. So Dr. Hanssen has given our traditions and our Constitution a tremendous amount of thought, and is quite inspiring, as you shall see. So, enough of the soporific part, on to the inspirational part. Let me introduce Dr. Hanssen.
Thank you. I love going to Constitution Day events myself. I've been to Constitution Day events up at Princeton University and at the University of Dallas regularly for the last 20 years. So I'm just a big fan. I thought about bringing my American flag to just wave up here at the podium, but then realized you all wouldn't have one. The Constitution Day events at Princeton University tend to be very kind of posh and preppy. Everybody standing around in bow ties, having cocktails. I think this year their Constitution Day speaker is asking whether Constitution Day is constitutional. So that kind of gives you the sense of what Princeton is up to, right? Constitution Day at the University of Dallas is very different. We have a raucous barbecue involving professors, graduate students, children, professors' children, alumni, their children. So there's a lot of children involved. It's a Catholic university, so there's a lot of big families. So a lot of children running around with little flags. We just had our Constitution Day speech, which was on freedom of speech. And then we have singing wars afterwards. It's a kind of boisterous, patriotic hymn, singing wars, different tables of the barbecue trying to out-sing each other. So I've seen Constitution Day celebrated in different ways in different places, but I'm excited to be here in Lubbock for Constitution Day. So the topic of my lecture is the Constitution and religion as a public good. And my argument in a nutshell is that constitutional guarantees of religious freedom have been generally viewed through a Jeffersonian or Madisonian lens. It was in 1947 in the Supreme Court case Everson, which was a busing case about whether local school boards could use local school board money to bus students to Catholic schools in their area. It was a busing case. It was actually, it was decided in favor of local school boards' right to use busing money to bus children to Catholic schools. But that was the first time in that case, in the Everson case in 1947, just after World War II. So if I put it this way as a historian, that recently, only 50 years ago, about half a century ago, that the Supreme Court first appealed to an originalist intent with regard to religious freedom jurisprudence. The first time that they actually appealed to Jefferson, appealed to Madison, and the first time that they imported into reflections on the First Amendment the phrase, a wall of separation, or as the majority opinion written by Black, Supreme Court Justice Black in Everson referred to, an impregnable wall of separation between church and state. And so I thought we could just begin by reading the actual First Amendment, just so that we can refresh our memory on the fact that the wall of separation phrase is not in the First Amendment, let alone an impregnable wall of separation is not in the First Amendment. So I think it's appropriate in the annual celebration of Constitution Day, when we're celebrating our political regime, that we do a little bit closer study of the text itself. And so I think it's worthwhile to have the text in front of us, right? So the text reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech or of press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So, first of all, it's an omnibus amendment, including freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition the government peaceably. The single clause related to religious freedom has two provisions. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it's been generally agreed that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, referred in the founders' original intent to the federal government, but not to the states, because there were states that had religious establishments at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. And this amendment guaranteed that the Congress would not do anything to touch those religious establishments. So it's generally agreed that at the time of the Constitution, this only referred to the federal government and not to the states. But it's also generally accepted. Justice Clarence Thomas did object to this just recently in the Masterpiece Wedding Cake Supreme Court case that came down. He made a little three-point shot and argued that there should not be an application of the incorporation doctrine of the 14th Amendment to the religious liberty clauses in the First Amendment. But it's generally agreed that the phrase, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, now applies also to the states, right? So the two clauses, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's the text, right? That's the text that I'm going to reflect on widely. Now for something completely different, right? All right. I teach at a small Catholic liberal arts university, the University of Dallas. University of Dallas doesn't sound like a Catholic university, but it is a small Catholic liberal arts university with two campuses, one in Dallas, Texas, and one in Rome, Italy. And so during the school year, I teach American civilization on our Dallas campus. And during the summers, I teach Western civilization on our Rome campus. I'm here invited for the Constitution Day lecture by the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. So I'm going to try to bring those two parts of my identity together, right? My study of American civilization on our Dallas campus and my study of Western civilization on our Rome campus, right? And the important thing about the University of Dallas's Rome experience, 80% of our student body study for one semester their sophomore year on our campus in Rome. The important thing to understand about the University of Dallas Rome experience is that it's not intended to be a study abroad program. It doesn't aim at language immersion in the Italian language. It doesn't aim at a multicultural encounter. It's not seen as going to a foreign country. Instead, the idea is that young Americans are in some sense going home, that they are trying to encounter the roots of their own civilization. They're trying to go back deeper underneath American civilization to Western civilization, right? Russell Kirk, in a classic book published in 1953, his title was The Roots of the American Order. And Russell Kirk argued that there are 5 cities which act as kind of heritage cities for America, from which we derive the roots of the American order. He says, if you want to understand the order of the American city, if you understand the order of the American soul, then you need to go back to Athens, Jerusalem, Rome, London, and Philadelphia. We need to go back to the beginnings of democracy in Athens, the Judeo-Christian moral order in Jerusalem, the rule of law and republicanism in Rome, the constitutional legal tradition in London, and how it was all brought together by the American founders in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. So the idea of our Rome experience, of the Rome semester, is not to encounter something foreign, but to encounter the deepest roots of our own homeland, right? So I want to begin this reflection on America's religious liberty regime in an unusual place, right? Not kind of where you would think we would go for understanding the American religious liberty regime. In the city of Rome, there is a park. In the city of Rome, in the northeast of the city, rising above Piazza del Popolo, right, above the northern gate of the city, right? You would go up the Corso and out to Florence, up the peninsula. Right? Above the northern gate of the city is the Villa Borghese. It's kind of the central park of Rome. It's where young couples bring their children in the evening to get a gelato and to stroll around the park, or to rent bikes or scooters, and to stroll along the balustrade where you can see the cityscape of Rome against the sunset with all the domes and the spires of the city. Right? It's a spectacular park. Right? And in the Villa Borghese is the Galleria Borghese, an art museum. Right? Now, the Galleria Borghese is not one of your kind of top-tier sites in Rome if you're going to Rome for the first time. Right? If you're going to Rome for the first time, everybody's got to go to the Vatican museums to see Renaissance Rome. You've got to see Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and, all of the majestic nudes of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right? Renaissance art, God the Father touching the, finger of Adam, right? Michelangelo's Renaissance Rome, right? Usually people go to see the tallest hill in Rome, the tallest of the 7 hills on which Rome is built, the Capitol, and go to the Capitoline Museum, which has all of Rome's antiquities, right? The equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. Right? The Galleria Borghese doesn't have mostly Renaissance Rome, and it doesn't have mostly ancient Rome. You go to the Galleria Borghese for the Baroque. Right? You go to the Galleria Borghese to see Bernini sculptures and Caravaggio paintings, right? They only let you spend 2 hours there, which gives you an hour with the Bernini sculptures on the first floor and an hour with the Caravaggios on the second floor, right? And then you're kicked out, right? And your €20 ticket only gets you 2 hours, right? So you go to the Galleria Borghese in order to see the sort of vigorous gestures of Bernini's Baroque sculpture, right? And to see the vibrant reds of Caravaggio's paintings. Right? And all of this, Baroque Rome, seems about as far as you could possibly get from the Puritan and neoclassical world of the 18th century British colonies, 13 original colonies, right? The world of the Protestant Reformation, Puritanism, the world of the Enlightenment, the neoclassical world of the colonies. Nevertheless, right, I want to begin our exploration of America's religious liberty regime there in the Galleria Borghese. in front of Bernini's famous statue Pius Aeneas, which I gave you a picture of. Don't look at the side that has my text on it. Turn it over so that you can see the full statue. And I have extra copies along here if you all didn't get a picture of it. Right? Now, this is not Bernini's most famous statue. Those of you who know your art history, usually when people think of Bernini's sculptures, right, they usually think of his Apollo and Daphne, where Daphne is turning into a tree. She's metamorphizing into a tree, and you can see her fingers turning into twigs, into leaves, right? And it's absolutely amazing to think that someone could do that in marble, right? Or you think of Bernini's Rape of Persephone, where Hades has got his arms around Persephone, and his hand is deep into the flesh on her thigh, and you can't believe it's marble because it looks so real, right? It's a sort of amazing craftsmanship of Bernini in marble. Nevertheless, his Pius Aeneas is one of his amazing 360 sculptures in the round, right? You have to circle the statue in order to get its full glory, right? And this is one of the most famous images from Rome's history. The founder of Rome, Aeneas, fleeing, burning Troy at the end of the Trojan Wars. Right? Instead of showing virtue on the battlefields, like Achilles, the greatest warrior, he shows a different kind of virtue. Right? He turns from the battle in order to take his father and the gods of his fatherland and his young son to flee burning Troy and to go in quest of a new land where he can plant the gods of his fatherland and build new Troy, build up the worship of God, Father, and country, the gods of his fatherland, the ways of his ancestors, right, devotion to his country in another place. Right? So this is Pius Aeneas, right? As he is given to us in Virgil's great epic poem, the Aeneid. Fleeing Troy, right? He's had messages from the gods. He's had a sign from the gods, a little glowing light over the head of his son, right? That have told him that he should take the lares and penates of his household and of his city and flee Troy. Right? And as the story goes, right, across the Aegean, across the Adriatic, he arrives in Rome and is the founder in his lineage of Rome. Right? At George Washington's death, there were two different figures. The classical and Christian American heritage came into play, and at his death, George Washington was described in eulogies both as the American Moses, leading the American people out of slavery, and as the American Aeneas, taking the gods of the old world and planting them anew in the new world, right? So in the typical sermons and eulogies on George Washington's death, he was either described as the American Moses or as the American Aeneas. This image, right, of broad-shouldered Aeneas bearing his father and his gods, leading his son who bears the hearth fire, has become for Western civilization the epitome of the virtue of justice, right, which places honor to God, Father, and country above all other obligations, right, as the very core of the virtue of justice. Right? The description of a righteous man, right, is someone who has piety to God, Father, and country. So iconic was this image of Pius Aeneas that George Washington purchased a sculpture of Pius Aeneas just after settling down, just after retiring from leadership in the Virginia militia at the end of the French and Indian War. Right? The great battle for empire between Britain and France was over. The worldwide struggle for continental India and continental North America, right, for control of the seas, think master and commander. Right? The British and the French going at it for worldwide control. That's a little later. That's the Napoleonic Wars, but you get the idea. Right? I hope some of you have seen the movie Master and Commander. So just as George Washington is retiring From his participation in the French and Indian War, he's just married the young widow, Martha Custis. He's just moved into Mount Vernon, looking for something to put on his mantelpiece. And he sends off, he's 28 years old, right, starting to decorate his home. 28 years old, Washington orders for himself from London, it says in one of his inventories, a group of Aeneas carrying his father out of Troy. In the same order, he purchased busts of Sallust, Terence, and Horace, a Latin grammar, and 2 Latin-English dictionaries, along with Joseph Addison's play Cato, a tragedy about Cato standing up to Caesar, Seneca's Morals, and Cicero's On Duties. This was clearly an attempt on Washington's part to remedy his lack of classical education at one of the colonial universities. George Washington was considered illiterate because he didn't know Greek and Latin. In order to get into one of the colonial universities, you needed to be able to translate Greek into Latin and Latin into Greek. Nobody cared about your English because English was a vulgar language. So George Washington is unusual among the American founders for not having that education. John Adams at Harvard, Thomas Jefferson at William and Mary, James Madison at Princeton, Alexander Hamilton at Columbia College in New York, all had that kind of classical education. George Washington did not attend university, and so you can see him at age 28, as soon as he's settling down from his illustrious military career, purchasing himself a sculpture of Pius Aeneas, and purchasing himself a copy of Cicero's On Duties, right, which was the textbook for moral philosophy courses in colonial universities and had been the textbook for moral philosophy courses throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages, right? It was a book that was second only to the Bible and Thomas à Kempis's Imitatio Christi as common reading in colonial America. It is Cicero who lays out with perfect simplicity the idea of natural law. Natural law, he says, is that which has not had its origin in the opinions of men, but has been implanted by some innate instinct, like religion, affection, gratitude, revenge, attention to one's superiors, and truth. Its first principles proceed from nature. Subsequently, some practices become established by universal custom from a consideration of their utility. Afterwards, the fear of the laws and religion sanctioned proceedings that originated in nature and had been approved of by custom. That's his kind of pocket definition of natural law, right? It begins in instinct, some innate instinct, and later on, fear of the laws and religious sanctions come in to reinforce something that originated in nature and has become approved of by custom. Cicero lays out the 2 great commandments of natural law, piety to the gods and piety to family and country. He says, religion is that which causes men to pay attention to and to respect with fixed ceremonies a certain superior nature which men call divine nature. Affection is that feeling under the influence of which kindness and careful attention is paid to those who are united to us by ties of blood or who are devoted to the service of their country. The sculptured image of Pius Aeneas and the teachings of Cicero on natural piety for God, father, and country had a symbiotic relationship for colonials with a classical education. The word piety in English has a kind of shrunken connotation. I'm always telling my students in their essays they need to be careful of connotation, right? That a word might not connote what you think it connotes, right? I had a student say that ideas about Roman republicanism from Polybius infiltrated the thought of the American founders. And I said, you do realize that infiltrate has a negative connotation. Do you intend its negative connotation? They're like, no, I didn't mean to say anything negative about it. No, I thought it was a good thing, You're like, well, then don't use the word infiltrate, because infiltrate connotes something, right? So the word piety in English has a shrunken connotation. It draws up a mental picture of an elderly lady in the back of a darkened church with her rosary beads, maybe wearing a chapel veil, right? But the word pietas in Latin had a much more robust, capacious connotation. broad-shouldered Aeneas, able to shoulder the burdens of the past and his ancestral customs, and to pass them on to his son. Right? It has a double connotation of piety to those we depend on and pity to those who depend on us. It has an upwards connotation and a downwards connotation. That's why Bernini's statue in the round, right, where it goes God, Father, Aeneas, and young son, right? It's kind of like almost like a genome before they knew about genomes, right? But this idea of piety upwards and then pity downwards, right? Piety upwards to those on whom we depend, and pity downwards to those who depend on us, our dependents. They had a very robust connotation, right? If justice was giving to each man his due, piety was that part of justice whereby we turn to face the communities that pre-exist us and are constituent parts of our being. No man is without a father and a mother, even if they're estranged or if their identity is hidden behind sperm banks and commercial surrogacy, or if the relationship is dysfunctional. The relationship exists prior to our willing it. It's a matter of discernment and acknowledgement rather than choice. And while in English the word family may connote the nuclear family unit, when one switches to Latin, or especially to Italian, if you add in the G into familia, right, suddenly we all think of the mafia, and suddenly the reality that family signifies becomes more apparent to us, a vast complex of ties to grandparents, great-grandparents, siblings, cousins, kith and kin, stretching out to the entire human family, a great societas that pre-exists the person and plays an integral role in the genetic formation of the individual's uniqueness. So familia, right, is a substantial reality, and piety or pietas to familia is a substantial moral obligation. Similarly, no man is without birthday or birthplace, right? As bodily creatures, we exist in space and time. You can't go to the passport office and say, I'd like a passport. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't have a birthday and birthplace. I just don't have one. You have to have a birthday and a birthplace. It's not possible for you not to have one. You may not know where it is or when it was, but you've got one. And this is the second great societas that gives birth to us, our nation. Literally our native land, our mother tongue and our fatherland, where our fathers died and our mothers shed their blood in bringing us forth. We may have citizenship in our native land by right of blood or by right of soil, by jus sanguinis or by jus solis, right? Right now, my brother married a Mexican. They're living in Rome, and if they're having their first baby, if the baby was born in Rome, it would have a right of American citizenship through jus sanguinis, through the right of blood, because it has an American father, right? But in fact, because of her permanent resident visa status, she's coming back to the States, and so the baby will be born in Virginia, and so we'll have jus solis, right of soil, having been born on American soil. You can do either, right? So it's a complex relationship, just as you have a complex relationship to your family, both through your maternal line and through your paternal line. You have a complex relationship to your native land, right? Your mother tongue, your fatherland, jus solis or jus sanguinis, right? It's a complex, rich relationship that shapes who we are before we have a say in our identity. Some people, like an uncle of mine who's Greek, he left Greece when he was 7 years old, and he's now 80 years old, and he has a very thick Greek accent. He's been living in the United States since he was 20. In other words, he's been living in the United States for longer than I've been living in the United States. But nevertheless, he has a thick Greek accent. He's evidently Greek, right? Our native land shapes who we are before we have a say in our identity, right? It is the land we first opened our eyes on, the language we were first taught with which to describe that vision. No matter how much we may prefer the French countryside of the Middle Ages, right, and wish we were a French peasant. I don't know if any of you wish you were a French peasant, but there are always some, old fogies who wish they were French peasants, right? Or you wish you lived in the heroic age of the Greeks, right? One bows humbly before the reality of having been born in Chicago of the 1970s. It's just true, and one has to just acknowledge the reality of one's existence, right? Coming to terms with reality, as C.S. Lewis says, till we have faces, right? Till we face the reality of who we are in terms of our parentage, in terms of our native land. We live until we have faces, until we can face up to the truth about ourselves. Moreover, every man has a unique relation to the cosmos, to the universe, to the great gathering or ecclesia of all that is, all that has been, and all that will be. This, too, is not a voluntary relationship. It's a matter of discernment rather than of choice. If there is an alpha, first principle of all that is, or an omega, a final end towards which all is tending, our relationship to it is the philosophic relationship of discernment and acknowledgement. We don't shop for universes down Church Street, choosing the Lutheran, the Presbyterian, Jehovah's Witness variety. We do our best to find a church that we take to have a true account of the actual universe that is, and our relationship to it. This cosmic societas of all that is in existence pre-exists us and is a condition for our existence and flourishing. So this was pietas as it was to Cicero in 44 BC. This is a pre-Christian understanding of pietas, right? Facing up to our obligations to the three great and necessary societies: familia, patria, ecclesia. A conjunction of religious reverence for the divine and affection for family and native land, an acknowledgement of debts too great to be repaid, but by public recognition and honor. For the ancients, religion had a clear and substantial definition, something that I think we're lacking in our current First Amendment religious liberty jurisprudence, is a clear and substantial definition of religion. For the ancients, religion was an acknowledgement of our radical contingency and the existential dependence. Religion was a rational insight into the human condition. Let us now turn a little bit more closely to George Washington's contributions to the practice and his writings with regard to our portrait of the American founders' thought on religious freedom. Right? What I'm suggesting here is that in 1947, when Everson decided to pull up a portrait of an originalist understanding of religious liberty, they missed someone. They missed George Washington. They went for Jefferson, and they pulled from Jefferson the phrase, the wall of separation, slapped on the word impregnable in front of it, called it the impregnable wall of separation. Right? But the wall of separation is not in the First Amendment. The wall of separation doesn't come from 1789. The wall of separation comes from a late letter of Jefferson in 1820. And it appears nowhere in the Constitution, but has become part of our constitutional jurisprudence on this issue. And so I think we need to recover George Washington and George Washington's understanding of the definition of religion. Washington does not present us with a single theoretical or legal document laying out his thought on the role of religion in a republic. We don't have a memorial and remonstrance on the issue, right, like we have from James Madison. We don't have a draft of a religious liberty bill for Virginia, as we have from Jefferson. We do have several paragraphs from George Washington's farewell address, right, which could be brought into religious liberty jurisprudence if any of our Supreme Court justices had the ingenuity to look into the historical record. But we do have a lot of George Washington's practice, right? What he actually did, both as general throughout the American Revolutionary period, with regard to chaplains, with regard to Quakers who refused to participate in military defense of the regime, with regard to proclamations of Thanksgiving days, proclamations of days of penance. We have George Washington's first inaugural address, we have George Washington's second inaugural address, his last will and testament, and his farewell address. So we do have scattered writings of George Washington, which I think we can put together in order to get a portrait of Washington's thought. And I think what we get is that Washington had a conception of religion as a public duty, rather than a private sentiment. And I think that in our religious liberty jurisprudence, we are heading more and more in the direction of ignoring religious liberty altogether, ignoring religion altogether, and simply looking at freedom of expression. The Constitution does not use the word expression at all. It uses freedom of religious practice, religious liberty, right of free exercise of religion, and freedom of speech. But we no longer use free exercise of religion. We no longer use freedom of speech. Instead, we've invented this new thing called freedom of expression, expressive activity, like burning the flag or a work of art, or and we've taken religion to be expressive behavior, right? And so if you've deeply held and sincerely felt this sentiment, then maybe we'll allow you to express it, right? And this couldn't be further from George Washington's understanding of religion as a public duty, right? So first, in 1789, on the occasion of the ratification of the United States Constitution, so not a minor moment in our history, in 1789, good date, right? 1789, just as the French king lost his head, we got a new head. We got a presidency, and the president. 1789, on the occasion of the ratification of the United States Constitution, Washington called for a national day of thanksgiving. He opened the Thanksgiving Day proclamation with a pronouncement, "Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor." The duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of God. I hope you know that George Washington's favorite name for God is Providence. He never used, to our knowledge, the word Jesus or Jesus Christ. He refers to the great author of all that is, right? This glorious and all-powerful being, Providence, a supreme judge, right? He usually uses very non-denominational language to refer to the divine. He says, "Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God." Again, in 1789, in his first inaugural address, Washington referred to religion as a national and public duty rather than a private and individual sentiment. He writes, "It would be peculiarly improper to omit, in this first official act, my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aid can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States, a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes. Intending this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments, not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large, less than either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States." Then, in 1795, when the danger of a foreign war had been averted, Washington called for another national day of thanksgiving, once again implying that the nation or the people had together a duty of public worship. I hope this sounds foreign to your ears. I'm trying to be very provocative. I think reading Washington on this is very provocative in light of our 50-year post-Everson reign of Jeffersonian impregnable wall of separation jurisprudence. I think it's a little shocking to go back to George Washington's practice at the very beginning of our nation. He writes, "In such a state of things, peace abroad and domestic tranquility, it is in an especial manner our duty as a people, with devout reverences and affectionate gratitude, to acknowledge our many and great obligations to Almighty God, and to implore him to continue and confirm the blessings we experience." Okay, so we come to the primary source, if there is a primary source of Washington to bring into comparison with Madison's memorial and remonstrance, or the letter of Jefferson, the late letter of Jefferson, which contains the wall of separation phrase. If there is a document of Washington's, it is the farewell address, which every school child used to be familiar with, which used to be quoted in every meeting of the Senate, because it contained a warning about entangling alliances. And so we always had to read that admonition against entangling alliances. That was discontinued in 1974, right around the time of the impeachment of Nixon, when a lot of great things in the American tradition kind of seem to have been lost along the way. But the farewell address of George Washington used to be, if I can use the word, religiously taught to generations, but has never yet been referred to by the Supreme Court in their religious liberty jurisprudence. Washington's farewell address, 1796, was not a speech, but a long letter to the American people in Philadelphia's largest newspaper, the American Daily Advisory. And I'm going to read you a lengthy passage from it. This is the longest sustained public exposition that Washington gives of his thought. He says, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who would labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of man and citizens. The mere politician, equally with a pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections to private and public felicity. 'Tis substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on the minds of a peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." So he refers to religion and morality. He always capitalizes religion. It's always religion with a capital R. Religion and morality as indispensable supports, great pillars of human happiness, and the firmest props of the duties of man and citizen. Now, in other words, Washington thought that reason and experience show, he always uses that little phrase, reason and experience, reason and reflection on history show, that the few, the stoic few, may be good on account of what he calls refined education. The less refined many require fear of eternal damnation and hope of eternal reward to fortify their character. Washington thought that the Madisonian position, whether we described it as strict separationist, no privileges, no penalties, libertarian, or neutral towards religion, failed to respect reason and the lessons of experience, which both taught that patriotic Republicans ought to recognize and endorse religion because only a religious citizenry could sustain Republican self-government. Now, it's been argued that Washington draws this argument for the utility of religion for public morality in A Virtuous Republic from Montesquieu, and that it's an essentially modern view. Obviously, I've been pushing Cicero in a big way, so I'm making the case that it's not just a modern view drawn from Montesquieu, but it's also a classical view drawn from Cicero. I hope you've noticed that part of my argument. If not, something's gone wrong, right? So it has to be read. While he's making an argument for the utility of religion for public morality, he says our oaths will mean nothing, right? If we don't teach the next generation religion. It also has to be read in the context of Washington's robust language about the duty of the nation, the duty of the people to worship the divine author of all our blessings. This language, the duty of piety, brings with it the reward of prosperity, or, a phrase that he uses quite frequently, draws down the righteous indignation of heaven. And this derives from a Ciceronian sense of natural law. Washington clearly saw that religion and morality are a seamless garment, a kind of closely woven tapestry of religious, moral, and civic duty, and that you can't pull one thread out of religious, moral, and civic duty and hope that the tapestry will remain. This is a very Ciceronian vision. We could call this Washington's nation under God vision. Now, I hope you all know that the under God phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance which was placed into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1904, in the Eisenhower years, 1954, in our great struggle against atheistic communism. Right? But I hope that you know that the under God phrase did not originate in 1950s McCarthy-era anti-communist America. Right? That the under God phrase has a lot longer history than simply 50 years ago. Right? Right? I wish I had a big whiteboard here where I could draw you a timeline, right? Because if you think that, right? If you think that, Wikipedia doesn't know about this, right? Wikipedia thinks that the Catholic organization, the Knights of Columbus, started using the under God phrase, and that from thence it was imported into the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s. If you think that, then you think that the wall of separation phrase came into our religious liberty jurisprudence, and the under God phrase came into our public discourse at the same time, 50 years ago. And they're both of recent vintage in some sense, right? But in fact, the under God phrase goes back a lot further. I hope you know that the under God phrase is in the Gettysburg Address, right? That Abraham Lincoln, sorry, I always get a little emotional when I think about the Gettysburg Address, when I even start to talk about it. In November of the year 1763, in November, which is traditionally the month of the dead, which begins with Halloween, All Hallows Eve, Feast of All Saints and All Souls. It's a typical time for people to go and refresh the flowers on their loved ones' graves and cemeteries. Right? November is when we have Veterans Day. Right? In the month of November, when the year itself is dying and the leaves are falling off the trees, unless you live in Texas where we only have live oaks and so the leaves fall off the trees perpetually. But in the month of November, when the dead leaves are falling off of the trees and you're praying for the dead, Lincoln was opening up the Gettysburg Cemetery. And at the Gettysburg Cemetery, Lincoln said, "We came to dedicate a portion of the Gettysburg battlefield to these dead, who here gave their lives that that nation might live. The great exchange of their lives, plural, for the life, singular, of the nation. The plural lives of the veterans for the single life of the nation, the great blood exchange, the lifeblood of the nation, its liberty." But he argued, because there's a famous but in the Gettysburg Address, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. We cannot dedicate with words, we cannot consecrate with blood, we cannot hallow, because human beings can't hallow anything. From whence cometh the grace that hallows something and makes it actually effective in the providential rolling of the years of history. So he says, it's already been consecrated, so the consecration has already been taken place because of their blood. We can't dedicate it, but we can be here dedicated. But hallowing, right? How will their sacrifice be hallowed? And so in the last instant of the Gettysburg Address, he ad-libbed the under God phrase. It wasn't in his text, it wasn't in his notes, but everyone heard it. The thousands who were gathered on the Gettysburg Cemetery field heard it. All of the newspaper journalists heard it. They telegraphed it back to New York and Massachusetts and Cincinnati and Chicago. And it was printed in all of the newspapers across the United States of America, the Gettysburg Address with the under God phrase. Every time Lincoln wrote it out afterwards, he included the under God phrase and signed it and dated it with his own hand. It is inscribed on the Lincoln Memorial in marble with the under God phrase. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So you could say the under God phrase did not come into American public discourse in 1954 during the Eisenhower years when it was put by Congress into the pledge. It came into American public discourse at that central moment of the saving of the Union in 1863, the year of the Battle of Gettysburg, the year of the Battle of Vicksburg, the turning of the tide of the American Civil War. But in fact, it goes back further than that. Whoa, historical archaeology, digging for the phrase, right? It goes back further than that. I hope some of you knew that, right? So that you were appalled that I was going to try to fob off on you the idea that it came from the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln, when he ad-libbed, right? When he knew how he would hallow the blood of these dead martyrs, right? He would refer to the nation under God, under God's providence. When he ad-libbed in that moment, right? He drew from the fact that as a child, one of the few books that he had in his log cabin, he had the Bible, and he had Parson Weems's biography of George Washington. And later in life, he got volumes of George Washington's correspondence and public papers and read through all of George Washington's public papers. And from Parson Weems picks up from George Washington's papers the fact that George Washington had almost a verbal tic. And so Parson Weems doesn't just quote George Washington, he starts to use it himself because he's immersed himself in George Washington's writings so much. This verbal tic is the under God phrase. George Washington used the phrase under God so frequently, right? Meaning, si Dios quiere, the way Mexicans today, Hispanics today will add on to anything, si Dios quiere, see you tomorrow, si Dios quiere. Right? God willing, simply meaning God willing. Right? This will happen, God willing. This will happen under God. Right? And perhaps the most memorable moment when George Washington used the under God phrase, which he used throughout his public papers, right, throughout his public pronouncements, but perhaps the most memorable moment when George Washington, sorry, I get excited. Perhaps the most memorable moment when George Washington used the under God phrase was on the 4th of July, 1776. Now, some people will say, the Declaration of Independence wasn't signed on the 4th of July, 1776. Yes, but the 4th of July was proclaimed to George Washington's troops, right, at Brooklyn Heights in New York on the 4th of July, 1776. And when George Washington had the Declaration of Independence read out to his American colonial troops as they were fighting the British in New York, on the 4th of July, 1776, when it was finished being read, he said, now everything depends, under God, on the force of your arms. So the under God phrase literally goes back to the 4th of July, 1776, George Washington. So my argument is that the under God phrase has as much a place in our religious liberty jurisdiction and our understanding of the American founders' understanding of religion's role in American public life, as Thomas Jefferson's late 1820 letter, which uses the phrase wall of separation, which didn't come into our religious liberty jurisprudence until 1947. Thank you.
So whatever.
We try to make an argument. Let's see what you think of it. Thoughts? Yes, good.
So you say, or what I'm getting from you is you say religion serves as a medium for morality, but you kept the word religion in more of a singular one-type context. So my question relates to how does this actually imply in the context of today when even within Protestant, so as non-Catholic type churches or Christian churches in general, there are varying views on a multitude of topics. much less. You have a Mormon church, you have Muslim churches or mosques, you even have the Satanic Temple. So how does these variety of religions come into your idea of a public, or as religion as a public good or religion as a public good, and also in the context of how is that hard on applied to today?
Is an excellent question. And I guess what I am suggesting is that by appealing to the ancients, by appealing to Cicero, who's reading Aristotle, by appealing to the ancients, we can perhaps get at a definition of religion, which is what I think is lacking, right? A singular definition of religion, which is is a kind of necessary thing to have if you're going to try to protect religion or religious practice. You need a definition of the thing. Right? A philosophic definition, which is not based on any one person's peculiar spiritual experience. Something that is rationally adjudicable. Right? That's why I suggested that for the ancients, religion is a rational insight into the human condition. Our radical contingency on all that is. Our understanding of the beginnings of all that is, or the end, the telos, the purpose of all that is. To have an account of where we've come from and where we're going, of the meaning of all that is, right? Now, I mean, I'll go out a little bit on a limb here. I prefer not to say this because, but I do think that maybe the idea of individual sola fides, right, a kind of very personal experience, as opposed to an understanding of religion as a public duty that everyone has an obligation to. Even James Madison talks this way. James Madison constantly refers to religion as a duty. And then you have a duty to worship the author of all being according to your conscience. But the duty is there prior to your conscientious discernment of how to fulfill that duty. Right? But that's the way the founders talked about it, as an objective, rational duty, which then we need to conscientiously discern how best to fulfill. Right? But I feel like we don't even have that two-step, right? That there's an objective, rational duty called religion, and then there's conscientious discernment as to how to fulfill that, right? But we don't have that kind of two-layered definition going. Is that at all helpful as an answer? I'll try to be more quick in my answers so we can get more questions.
That was a good answer.
Yes.
That was a really good answer. We seem to have lost our grip on what is the common good. Could you give us some rehearse with us some of the features of the common good? At least from the perspective of our founders.
Right.
Because they had a better grip on it than I think any of us do.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the ways that Washington thinks about religion as a public good, or religion as useful for the common good, is that the more people are imbued with a religious sense of moral obligations, which may be one way of thinking about it, right? A religious sense of moral obligations, that your moral obligations have the force of religion behind them, right? That you're afraid of, I think his phrase is fascinating, you're afraid of the righteous indignation of heaven, right? If I don't take care of my elderly parents, I'm afraid of the righteous indignation of heaven, right? I mean, that you have the religious force behind what are taken to be moral obligations. That you will need a more intrusive government to force you to do those things, or to take over those activities that people would otherwise voluntarily take care of themselves, right? And so if you aspire to liberty, right, in some sense he sees, well, the word spring, which people say comes from Montesquieu, religion as a spring, right, that impels moral activity, and particularly moral activity in the direction of family building and nation building, right? So social activity, community network building, right? It ties up, we talk about the ties that bind, right? Religion tends to impel us to pay more attention to the ties that bind, right? And so it's a social thickener, right? And the more you have religion social thickening, the less you need government on the other end performing those functions that otherwise people would have performed for themselves, educating their children, taking care of their elderly parents, taking care of the sick, taking care of the indigent, right? So there's a kind of preservation of liberty. I mean, do we think about this, right? That more religious practice equals more liberty, right? And less intrusive government. So that's kind of the push and pull that Washington is watching, right? How he sees religion and liberty as being related to each other, right? So that's the public good is liberty. The common good is liberty, right? Which we lose to the extent that that we're not actually out there performing those sort of civic functions. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. Yes. What was your question? Sorry, I'll get to you in a second.
I'm thinking about these ancient models of religion, Cicero, and let's say the story of Caius Annius.
Yes.
In Cicero's time, religion is the means by which you get elected next high priest, like Julius Caesar did. He used it to launch his dictatorial career. That also Cicero failed when assassination of the Republic fell. In this view, and that when it fell, after Caesar and his young grandnephew takes the reins, he uses this myth, which was not popular in Rome until the Julio Claudians came into control and said, we descend from these guys, so you guys are going to accept our authoritarian regime, not a republic, by religion. And so I think the thing is that they know both sides here, that it's a way of promoting freedom, but using the muse and the late republic, they also know that it's incredibly dangerous at the same time.
Yeah.
That's how, the emperor gains power.
Right. Yes.
So,
Good. Thank you. Yes. So if I could give one book recommendation, and this is actually fun reading, so fun that it should be turned into a movie, and I'm in shock that Hollywood has never discovered this. As maybe some of you are screenwriters and want to do a movie of this. George Washington's favorite play, I mentioned it already, Joseph Addison's Cato. It was the 18th century blockbuster. Started on the London stage in 1710. It was popular all over the colonies, even though they didn't really do theater going in the Puritan colonies, right? But George Washington first read it when he was 14 years old, started to play act it, started to take phrases from it. Give me liberty or give me death is a line from Joseph Addison's Cato. I regret that I only have one life to give for my country is a line from Joseph Addison's Cato. So it's the ur-text. I like to tell my students, it's kind of the Princess Bride of the 18th century. Right now, we all quote Princess Bride, my name is Inigo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die, or whatever. These words that you keep saying, I do not think it means what you think it means, right? So we use Princess Bride, right? The way that the 18th century American founders used Joseph Addison's Cato. So, and anyway, it's a great story, takes place with Cato in North Africa, fighting against he's fighting against Caesar. There's great female characters. There's a great African prince character. Why is Hollywood not doing this? The whole point, George Washington's favorite play, the hero is an African prince. Just think about that. George Washington, slaveholding Virginia plantation owner. His favorite play, the hero, is an African prince who is a better imitator of Cato's virtues than Cato's own sons. Virtue passes down by imitation and not by blood is one of the lessons of the play, right? Anyway, why am I bringing this up? What does this have to do with what you brought up? George Washington has a definitely 18th century Christianized classicism, right? This is the transferred classicism of the post-medieval world, right? So there's a definite tinge on it. This is the Ciceronian tradition rather than Cicero of 44 BC, right? There's something else I was going to say with regard to that. Yes, I mean, between Cicero and George Washington, there's something else that one would have to pay attention to, and that is the render unto Caesar's the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's, right? The creation of a religious society which refuses to become the secular authority at the same time, right? And which claims to be more universal than the empire and more intimate than the polis. So that would be another lecture entirely, but you're absolutely right that between the ancient world and its view of religion as intimately bound up with the state and George Washington's use of Cicero, shall we say?
But the people arguing for the separation have that deep knowledge, and they're the ones saying we need the law. Whereas Washington has this layman's knowledge and said, no.
Well, yeah, Washington, I think the Ciceronian tradition of pietas comes into the Christian tradition and shapes George Washington in ways that it didn't shape Jefferson, right? I think Jefferson has neither the Ciceronian nor the Christian view, right? Whereas George Washington has both a sort of Christianized Ciceronian view, if that's a way of putting it. Your question, sir.
Yeah, so I've been very interested in trying to find an objective way to determine what's the optimal point, an axis that has individual liberty on one side and civic duty on another side. So what is the proper balance for a good society? So if you have a group of purely selfish people, and it's a private world, so they can't force other people to do what they want, they have to at least pretend to be concerned about the welfare of the community, because if everybody hates them, nobody will do business with them. Mm-hmm. So if they want to be successful, they have to be at least tolerated, preferably liked. So there are reasons even for selfish people to want to get along with their neighbors. At the other end, you can have people who are just devoted to the public good, and sometimes get so devoted to the public good that they fail to see that the public good is strangling the ability to sustain it. Mm-hmm. So did George Washington come upon the correct division, but maybe he failed to properly articulate it? Mm-hmm. Clearly religion is one mechanism to achieve duty towards community. It's one enforcement mechanism. It's not the only one, but it's definitely one. So was George Washington's vision the proper boundary, or was he just stabbing and maybe got close to it? Right. So is there a proper boundary, a proper balance between individual liberty and civic duty?
So I tend to think of individualism and statism growing simultaneously and symbiotically. the more you have lone individuals, right? Because individuals are only truly independent for about 10, 20 years of their life, right? They're the students who I teach in college, right? They think they're lone individuals in the state of nature, right? Because they don't realize how much debt they're racking up. The federal government is giving them federal loans, right? But they think, right? They eat at a cafeteria, somebody makes their food for them, they've got a gym where they can work out, they've got a nice housing arrangement, they buy their own books using federal money, everything's sort of set up for them, everything's for them, by them. You want to study abroad, you want to do this, do you need advising, do you need more advising, do you need help, do you need career planning, sort of like, so for a little bit people think they're independent, right? But that's ignoring childhood dependence and old age dependence, right? So the more you have this vision of individualism and individual independence, right? The more you need a state to take care of all those who aren't independent, right? And I think what we've lost is the idea that religion acts as a thickening agent, binding together the dependent and the independent, right? Religion is societas, right? Religion is a thickening agent for societies, the family of the society, the family of the church, the family of the nation. I say nation here as opposed to state. I think there's such a thing as a state apparatus, right? Or questions about a regime. But you can have a nation that goes through several regimes, right? But the nation is still national, right? It's a language, it's a culture, that's a thickening agent. So there's these are intermediary societies between the individual and the state apparatus, right? So I wouldn't put nation at quite the same as state, right? And so religion is part of piety. It is a thickening agent. Two good books on this. Barry Allen Shane's book on individualism, where he makes the argument that Protestantism is not to blame for individualism, that Protestantism actually contributes enormously to the building up of community in the colonial and early Republican period. Right? It was an interesting argument because a lot of people will blame individualism. Even I sometimes blame individualism on the Protestant Reformation. But that's a useful book. And the other one is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, how once upon a time, when we had that thickening agent, right, people belonged to a lot of civic organizations, and they say this is one of the ways that you can prevent suicide is to multiply the number of organizations that you're a part of, right? Different kinds of organizations, PTA, parent-teacher associations, the local, lodge, the group for cleaning up the highway, and then your, personal business, and then, your family, and then your church, and then the more organizations that you're a part of, the less likely it is that you'd commit suicide, right? And Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, is noticing that Tocqueville says Americans are really good at this. Americans are really good at building societies, right? Intermediary societies, so neither individual nor state, but these intermediary societies, voluntary associations, right? He says they used to bowl together. All of these groups used to go bowling together. He says now people are bowling alone. And bowling alleys are closing because bowling alleys don't make money on bowling. Bowling alleys make money on pizza and soda. When you bowl with your group, you eat. When you bowl alone, you don't eat. So the bowling alleys are closing. Anyway, so those are two books about this phenomenon of where we're becoming more and more individualistic and more statist. But what we're losing is that thick middle ground of voluntary associations, and that somehow a religious sense of moral obligation to others is a thickening agent in that middle territory. Right? I don't know if that helps at all. Yes, you have a question.
You made a reference, and I didn't quite get the context of it, to Richard Nixon in the year 1974. Can you elaborate on that?
Richard Nixon, 1974. What was that? Oh, sorry. Yes, a lot of bad things happened, but well, yes, that's true. Well,
I mean, you probably weren't alive in 74,
No, I was just alive.
just
That was the year I was born. So anything that happens in 1974, I'm particularly interested in, because I take it to be my heritage in a special way. So the one bad thing that I was referring to is that that the Senate used to always open with a reading of the passage from George Washington's farewell address, where he warns against getting involved in entangling alliances with other nations. And that senatorial tradition went defunct somewhere around 1974.
Oh, so we didn't have much to do with Nixon at all. Other than the fact that was the year he was on.
Yeah.
Opening China trade.
Yeah. We decided we were going to go for entangling alliances after that. I know, I'm sorry, so it didn't actually have a lot to do with Nixon. Yeah, sorry. We went off the gold standard. One of the good things that happened in 1974, I might as well just mention it, is that in a desperate act to try to get people to come to 4th of July celebrations during all of the anti-American demonstrations during the Vietnam War, in a desperate act to try to get people to come to 4th of July celebrations, the Boston Pops decided to have their celebrations outside in the shell along the Charles River and to time their fireworks to the 1812 Overture, thereby making the 1812 Overture a great American 4th of July tradition. So, good things.
There.
You were there?
Van Shell was on this thing called the Esplanade.
Yeah.
And there was a little bridge from my fraternity house right to the Esplanade. So admission was free.
If you young folks have not listened to the 1812 Overture with live cannon, right, on the 4th of July, I mean, you got to blast it as loud as it could possibly go, and you got to get the right recording of it that has live cannon. I mean, it is a choral piece with the bells, and I mean, there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. Anyway, so that's one good thing that happened. Yes.
Really enjoy your presentation. This is really refreshing. Thank you.
Good. As long as it's an enjoyable evening, that's what we
I have a
want.
question, and I apologize if I missed the correlation in.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking that George Washington's concept of under God goes back to Aeneas, Annus Coeptus, which is on a verse of our Great Seal, where Aeneas' son pulls the arrow, God looks down, God approves, and the nation is founded under God's approval.
I didn't think of that. I didn't think of that.
But that goes
Yeah.
back to the original
Yeah.
under God,
Um,
which is then on our back, our first seal, the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the Order of the Ages.
Right. Yeah. Do you know, I don't want to leave with giving the impression that this is a fight among the founders, and it's Madison versus Jefferson versus Washington, and just adding Washington because it's bigger than Washington. It is the 150 years worth of American political practice at the state level and at the federal level up until Everson imports the wall of separation language. So the states acted this way. Religion was a public good and necessary in public education. The Northwest Ordinance, which is the law for the entire Midwest, the biggest heartland of America, right? It instructed them to make sure that religion and piety and morality were taught in schools and gave public money for that, right? So it's not as if like George Washington had his weird esoteric, like classical Ciceronian view, and then Jefferson had his weird view, one with separation, like one of them is actually established American practice for 150 years, right? Up until the post-World War II period, when our religious liberty jurisdiction seems to have hit a dead end. I'll show you a dead end. Here's a dead end. We watch the Supreme Court simply punting, right? Completely tongue-tied. 2003, the New Dow case on the under God phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Some man says it's coercion for my daughter to have to sit in class and listen to other people do the Pledge of Allegiance with the under God phrase in it. She's not being forced to participate, right? He says her having to listen to other people recite the pledge is coercion of religious practice. This goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the majority ruling says you don't have standing in court to bring this case because you don't have legal custody of your daughter. No comment on the under God phrase. I mean, that's called, we've reached a dead end. Well, I have nothing to say to this. I'm completely clueless as to, so we've kind of reached a dead end there, right? Sorry, I don't want to end on the word dead end. So could someone else ask a question, please? Second questions all round. Ooh, then it turns into a conversation. Yes.
So, you kind of briefly touched on this, but you're talking about how this view went on for such a long period of time. What were the other views along with it that had as big a stake in the political, the social mindset, as well as the religion as a public good part of that? Or were there separate opposing views that existed during that time frame, or did they just pop up during that hard wall moment in history? Or what was, like, what's the context of what you're talking about?
Okay, so I'm not a con law professor, so I'm not familiar with all of the constitutional law cases from the beginning that refer to the First Amendment. Something I would love to do, and I would love to sit in on a common law class and do it. It would be really fun. I encourage everybody to find such a thing and take it. I am aware from my study of Abraham Lincoln so the two moments that I think that come in as real challenges to what I would call America's happy, actually, it's John Adams who uses the phrase, a mild and liberal establishment, right? We had a mild and liberal establishment, right, of generic Protestantism, right? And it really wasn't, it didn't rise to the level of Supreme Court jurisprudence very frequently. The Mormons and polygamy, right? And then nativism against Catholics, right? And so I think, those are two moments that I'm aware of when this actually becomes tense, right? Because generic Bible teaching in public schools was everywhere, right? And it was Catholics not wanting their children to just have generic Bible teaching, right? But to have explicitly Catholic, like, traditional commentary on the Bible, right? Along with it, it starts to break up that consensus, right? So I think, and that really doesn't come. Anyway, it's a very, once you get into the details, it does get complicated. That really doesn't even come to the fore because Catholics, poor as they are, Catholics come in the poorest of the poor, right? So poor that they get jobs in cities. Anybody with any money is able to move west and get land, right? If you don't have any money, you end up in the cities working in the mills and on the docks. So they come in the poorest of the poor, but regardless of being the poorest of the poor, they found and fund their own entire parochial school system. So they pay taxes for the local school where religion is publicly funded, and it's generic Bible teaching Protestantism that's being publicly funded. They pay those taxes, and they also pay for their parochial schools, right? So they're paying twice, no matter how poor they are, and they build up this entire parochial school system. So that's going on in the 1830s, nativism, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, right? 1890s, the Italians show up, the Italian Catholics, Poles start showing up, 18 or so. So what's wrong? Like, why does this come to a head in 1947 with the busing case of Everson, right? Partly it comes to a head because of GI Bill money. But now they want to take federal funding and go to college and go to secular colleges, right? Anyway, so the post-progressive era, where you have a lot more public funding, right? not a lot of public funding available, right, prior to the progressive era, right? The 20th century, suddenly there's a lot of federal money to be given away, right? And so suddenly everybody's playing for a lot higher stakes, right? You look at Catholic colleges today they've all taken the pill, right? Um, they're all using FAFSA funds, right? Just as much as, so whether you're at a public school or at a Catholic school, you're probably using federal money to fund your education, right? So, anyway, sorry, that's another long, but I think there's probably an uneducated answer, but the only thing prior to Everson that really pops up in terms of religious practice, which raises this question of free exercise, is polygamy with the Mormons. You had another question. You had another question. Oh,
That's
can we do
correct.
two more? One
Two
here
more?
and one there?
All right.
Yes.
This is, the Fleming case was in the late 1800s. Hugo Black, I think, was perpetrating a fraud on the American public with his decision in Everson versus Board of Education. Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association was assuring the Baptists that they were not going to be overcome by all the Protestants, the other Protestants that are around, the Calvinists. A total misrepresentation of what that letter said, and that fraud has continued in American jurisprudence since Hugo Black did that to us.
Great book on that topic by Drakeman. Great book on that topic. Drakeman is the last name. Excellent book on this, on Everson. One has to realize when Madison and Jefferson were talking about free exercise, they were usually talking about Baptists being free. From a Presbyterian establishment, a Lutheran establishment, or an Episcopalian establishment, they were giving freedom to Baptists.
Right.
Like, this is supposed to benefit Baptists. Like, that's what Madison and Jefferson were talking about. Like, that's who were claiming religious liberty in the 18th and 19th century, right? So it kind of blows your mind, how far we've come. Yes?
So there's sort of a question about George Washington, whether or not, since he referred to Puritan nation, of course, he is Church of England as a Virginian, most of these other events you're mentioning, and how he treats Quakers. And so we have this tradition of fleeing for religious freedom, but we also have a lot of colonies that are fully aligned with that, viewing the king as the head of their church. Mm-hmm. So does Washington ever write about how he feels about the fact that he breaks with the head of his church by being part of American independence? Does he ever talk about that?
No. He's on the opposite side of Madison in the question of taxpayer funding paying clerical salaries, clergy salaries in Virginia. He's with Patrick Henry, who wants that to continue. But no, I don't see any comment from George Washington on right. Yeah, the act of supremacy and the fact that he's in some. I mean, that seems to me very attenuated by the time you get to the Hanovers. I mean, the monarchy is very. We have this tendency in America, very bad tendency in America, to think that there was absolutist monarchy, and then in 1776 there was the first great experiment with democracy, which of course is absurd. First of all, the first great experiment with democracy is Greece, so it's been experimented with long before. And the Georges, George I, George II, George III, the Hanoverian Georges, were not absolutist monarchs. Jefferson is excruciatingly clear that bodies of men, as well as lone individuals, can be inhabited with a spirit of tyranny. The tyrant against which the colonials fought was a tyrannous parliament. Power was in the hands of the parliament. Power was not in the hands of... Sorry? He does only name the king in the Declaration. But that's because he thinks the king is not exercising is not not exercising his appropriate executive authority to restrain his tyrannous parliament, right? Which, of course, was an absurd thing to expect the Hanovers to be able to do at that late date when they'd been shorn of that power once by being executed in the Civil War and then deposed in the Glorious Revolution. The Hanoverian Georges were not going to do anything. I mean, that's actually in God Save the Queen, right? God Save the King, right? May he defend our laws and ever give us cause to sing with heart and voice, God save the King. In other words, if he doesn't defend our laws, we won't have cause. And we will either execute him or depose him, as we've done with his ancestors. So there's no absolutist monarchy, and I'm not sure they're even thinking, really, of the king as head of the Church of England in that way. You know, it's very symbolic at that point. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.